As Mexico's drug war rages on, so too does the debate in the United States about how much it is, or isn't, affecting U.S. communities that lie along the more than 3,000-kilometer border that separates the two North American countries. With the lucrative drug cartel trafficking routes leading north to the world's largest consumer of illicit drugs, many worry that the violence is spilling over into the United States. Politicians urge that the spillover violence is a serious national security threat, and that the border, as well as immigration enforcement policies, must be militarized in order to combat the looming shadow of Mexican drug cartel violence. But how much of it is true? Has the U.S. border with Mexico really become an out-of-control and violent no-man's land? Politicians like Arizona Governor Jan Brewer and others would certainly have us think so, although national crime statistics suggest that the border region is actually safer than many other areas in the United States. In 2010, the same year that controversial Arizona immigration bill SB 1070 was signed into law by Governor Brewer, she famously stated that there had been multiple headless bodies found in the desert. Although the statements were later revealed to be completely false, she was reluctant to retract her statement as she ran her campaign for governor, as shown during this 2010 Arizona governor's debate and subsequent press conference.
What is hurting us right now, economically, are statements, false statements made by Jan Brewer about how Arizona has become so violent, that we are a place of fear, that we have beheadings in the desert. Those are false statements. They cause people to think that Arizona is a dangerous place, and they don't come here and they don't invest here because our governor has said such negative things about our state. And Jan, I call upon you today to say that there are no beheadings. That was a false statement, and it needs to be cleared up right now.
And you know, Terry, I will call you out. I think that you ought to renounce your support and endorsement of the unions that are boycotting our state.
Brewer, why wouldn't you recant the comment you've made earlier about the beheadings in the desert?
Seriously, that's a serious question, Governor.
Well, this was an interesting evening tonight.
Governor, please answer the question. About the headless bodies. Why won't you recant that? You still believe that? Come on, Governor.
Okay, thank you all.
Governor, what do you make?
While Governor Brewer did eventually retract her false statement about the headless bodies, she still maintains that spillover violence is a serious problem in Arizona. The question was brought up in a recent interview with the New York Times Magazine on August 24th, when the governor was asked, "When you signed Arizona's immigration law in 2010, you cited concerns about growing border violence, but according to the FBI, violent crime dropped in Arizona almost 14% the previous year." Governor Brewer responded by stating that, as the saying goes, there are lies, damned lies and statistics. 50,000 people in Mexico have been murdered. Puerto Peñasco, 60 miles south of our border, just had 5 people and a police officer killed. That is like part of Arizona, and it is spilling over into our state. In April 2012, the Washington Office on Latin America, or WOLA, released a report detailing the results of a year-long investigation entitled Beyond the Border Buildup, which sought to deconstruct the recent political rhetoric and policy initiatives surrounding border security issues in order to assess the on-the-ground reality of a region that has increasingly been described as a war zone by people like Governor Brewer. Senior WOLA associate Maureen Meyer co-authored the report, meeting with various law enforcement agency officials, NGOs, politicians, and academics across 3 border regions in Texas, Arizona, and California. As part of their investigation, Meyer and her colleagues researched the much-discussed phenomenon of spillover violence on the border to determine fact from fiction.
On spillover violence, I think our main conclusion is it's really not happening, especially not at the levels that a lot of politicians would have us believe in terms of this massive wave of violence that's certainly affecting Mexican border cities, is affecting the U.S. side of the border. I think if you look obviously at both official statistics in terms of FBI statistics on the U.S. side, speaking with lots of local law enforcement agencies, local politicians, we find that overall violent crime's actually down on the border. The homicide rates are lower in a lot of border cities than they are across the country in the United States. And in places like El Paso, you have one of the cities with one of the lowest homicides rates in the United States, bordering one of the most violent cities in the world, Ciudad Juarez, and you don't see that high level of violence. Not to say there are not isolated incidences out there. Certainly ranchers have expressed concern about violent acts on their lands, but the overall idea that somehow the border area is filled with violent criminals affecting U.S. communities hasn't really manifested itself.
The Real News traveled to the Arizona-Mexico border to take a closer look at the ways in which spillover violence from Mexico's drug war was or wasn't affecting United States communities. In Nogales, Arizona, the state's largest and most active port of entry with Mexico, we met with Santa Cruz County Sheriff Tony Estrada. Estrada has over 4 decades of law enforcement experience in the Nogales region, nearly half of which he has served as Santa Cruz County's sheriff. He says that while there are isolated cases of violence related to drug trafficking, the political rhetoric seeking to portray border communities as unsafe and rife with drug cartel-related spillover violence is exaggerated.
In the Arizona side, we don't see the kidnappings, we don't see the extortions, we don't see the drive-bys, we don't see the home invasions, we don't see the murders. What we do see, because there is violence, is restricted to this activity in the remote valleys and canyons and mountains of Santa Cruz County, away from the urban area and away from a lot of the rural residents as well. That's where we're seeing some of this violence. Predators preying on illegals, preying on smugglers that are bringing drugs, rip-off crews. We have had murders. I can tell you that because of the amount of drugs and people that go through here, which is very, very active, you're going to have situations. You're going to have situations that are going to be dangerous and they're going to be violent. But it has been restricted mostly to the people that are actually involved in this type of activity.
According to Sheriff Estrada, even with the isolated incidences of violence, the border area is still considerably safer than many cities in the United States interior. He attributes the relatively lower crime rate to the heightened concentration of resources to the numerous law enforcement agencies operating along the border. Still, he says much of the stepped-up enforcement has inadvertently pushed some of the more lucrative drug trafficking routes into the remote areas along the border that are more difficult to patrol, where a growing number of ranchers have become alarmed over the presence of drug traffickers on their property.
Communities along the border are probably the safest communities in the nation because of all of the deployment of technology and personnel and expertise that has been applied here. So when people say that there's violence, I can only tell them, yes, but no more than anywhere else. But I would say that if you consider the activity, the issue of drugs, and the issue of legal immigrants that are coming through this area, then you would definitely expect that to be a higher percentage, a higher rise in crime, and it's not. I can tell you one thing, that probably some of the ranchers out in the county are concerned, and rightfully so. They are concerned because that's where a lot of activity is going to. But we get very little reports, very few reports about confrontations or encounters.
Ed Ashurst and Don Kimball are 2 ranchers from neighboring Cochise County, whose properties lie in a vast and sparsely populated region straddling the U.S. border with Mexico. They say the remoteness of the area they live in has attracted drug traffickers, and that the government has not done enough to combat their growing presence.
All of us, all the ranching community along the border feels like we are people without a country. We have been abandoned by the federal government.
But the same old song and dance from Napolitano and Obama, that the border is safer and more secure than it's ever been, is the biggest lie that is being told in the United States today. It's a dangerous situation. There's people crossing our land on a daily basis, either carrying drugs or trying to get into the U.S. to hunt for jobs, but the dangerous situation is the drug trafficking that goes on every day, and it tries to go undetected. So our areas out here are vast and open, and there's a lot of ways they can go and hide. Once they get 2 or 3 miles from the border, they can go so many different ways, up the draws and through the brush and the mesquites, and the Border Patrol has a heck of a time trying to catch these individuals, and ICE is out there too working on it, trying to catch them. But for every 2 loads of dope that they catch, I bet there's 10 that go through undetected.
Ashurst and Kimball's neighbor and fellow rancher, Rob Krentz, was killed 2 years ago in a highly publicized murder case that ranchers, politicians, and the media portrayed as an alarming example of growing spillover violence. Though it was never determined who actually killed Krentz and under what circumstances, the talk of the town and the papers all jumped to the conclusion that it was a Mexican drug smuggler. Rumors quickly became fact, as seems to be the norm when discussing spillover violence on the border, and the isolated murder case, along with an incident in which a Border Patrol agent was killed, quickly became more fuel for the border war scenario fire. Ed Ashurst maintains that the situation has gotten totally out of control, and that ranchers like himself are living in a constant state of danger due to the drug trafficking activity along the border.
In all these ranches in this area, there's probably 600 to 800 people live here. In a 3-year period, starting in the fall of '07, 80% of the people that have lived here have been burglarized by outlaw Mexicans. A full 80%. Many of them have been burglarized many times. There's been at least one murder. There's been dead Mexican bodies found. There's been tons and tons of dope found.
Ranchers in the remote regions say that Border Patrol and other law enforcement agencies are not patrolling the actual border, but areas farther inland, and that they are rarely quick to respond, at times taking several hours to show up after ranchers call to report an incident. Pola's Maureen Meyer says that reports of drug trafficking in the remote regions need to be investigated more seriously by the authorities, but that even with increased smuggling activity in these areas, overall violence on the border remains low compared to the rest of the country.
Well, I think there certainly is a distinction to be made from some of the very populated or more populated areas along the U.S.-Mexico border region to, as you mentioned, some of the very remote parts of the border, which are actually in a lot of cases the routes used by drug traffickers, for example, to traffic drugs into the United States. Undoubtedly, there are concerns. These concerns should be taken seriously. I think a lot of question is, how much are authorities actually investigating these accusations of incidents? A lot of what we heard about allegations of spillover violence is a lot of hearsay. So I think the need to really look at, particularly in these remote areas, what is going on. The truth is, as we mentioned about drugs are flowing into the United States through the border, a lot through the ports of entry, but a lot are also trafficked in the remote areas that are more under the control of the Border Patrol. I think there is something to that. There's certainly, as you look at the situation in Mexico, drug traffickers have become more violent, using more violent methods. So these concerns shouldn't be brushed under the carpet. They should be taken seriously. But I think it goes back to how much is this more a problem in the rural, remote areas, and how much is it something where you can say the whole U.S.-Mexico border is out of control and full of violent criminals?
As the election season heats up, the spillover violence debate will certainly flare up in discussions surrounding immigration and national security issues in the United States. But how much of the rhetoric surrounding the elusive notion of rampant spillover violence is fact, and how much of it is merely opportunistic border hawks like Arizona Governor Jan Brewer playing the politics of fear? Reporting from the Arizona-Mexico border, this is David Doherty with the Real News Network.